Hello, I'm Rose Levy Beranbaum, author of the Bread Bible and author of Rose's Heavenly Cakes. I'm here in the Betty Crocker Kitchens to share some wonderful baking tips. Bread dough can be made in an electric mixer really quickly, but I sometimes like making it by hand just to feel the dough. And kneading it by hand is really an enjoyable process, but if you've done it in a mixer as I've done it here, I sometimes like to finish it off by hand. And you can see it's really sticky. And that's because I like my dough to be very light and full of air and holes, and the only way you can do that is by not working too much flour into the dough, which is sometimes a little hard to handle, but you can wash your hands afterwards. So you can see it's almost ready to stick to my fingers, but I want the minimum amount of flour on me and on the board. And what I do is I fold it in, and the motion is using the heels of your hand. You just bring it forward and push it away from you. And I can see if I need to add more flour at this point, if it's really, really sticky. And this is perfect, so I don't have to add any more than the bare minimum that was on the breadboard. I like using the breadboard. You can use a Formica counter or marble, but wood, there's something about dough and wood that really is beautiful together. It's a little rough and gives a little resistance. And how can you tell when you've kneaded enough? Well, you could see how soft the dough was before I started. And now it's coming together. The protein is developing into gluten. And it's getting a really smooth, and it feels cool. It was actually warm as it was rising a bit after mixing and sitting, but the alcohol in the dough starts making it feel cool, so that's another sign. And now when I turn it over, it forms a nice smooth ball instead of flattening out, sort of puddling, and that's a well-kneaded dough. Can't you just wait to do it yourself? I'm going to show you how to shape a perfect, simple bread loaf, your basic bread loaf. Here's the dough, and always keep dough covered so that it doesn't crust and dry out. And it's risen, it's doubled in volume, and you can tell that it has because when you press it, it holds the depression. Now the best thing to do to get a perfect shape is to let the dough rest after you've put it on the breadboard or cutting board for about 20 minutes. But I'm going to go ahead and shape it right away. And we put the smooth side down. And you know how sometimes with bread you get open spaces inside, and if you're making grilled cheese, the cheese leaks right through those holes? The way to avoid that is what's called dimpling the dough. You create dimples, and that gets rid of any big air bubbles. And you can see it's a nice, soft, moist dough, because if it were dry and had too much flour in it, you wouldn't get a nice light loaf either. And this is the point where I would normally just fold it into thirds and let it sit covered for 20 minutes. But I'm going to proceed to do the shaping right away. And in order to get a good shape, you want to have a minimum of flour on your board. You want to have a little resistance, and I'll show you as I start shaping it. See how really nice and stretchy it is? You start at the top and bring it forward and push it back. And roll the next one. And as you roll it, you can see that it keeps getting longer and longer. It ultimately has to be close to the length of the loaf pan that you're using. And the loaf pan should be lightly sprayed or coated with nonstick cooking spray. When you use a pan very often, you don't even have to coat it. It gets kind of conditioned. When you get to the very end, seal it with your thumb all the way along, and that's going to end up at the very bottom. And you see I have these parts sticking out? Just tuck them in. That's when you see those beautiful little rolled at the edges of the bread loaf. Or you can even shape them and tuck them under the bread completely. Put it into the pan, and this is the right size pan, because it should not be more than a ½ inch from the top. to enable it to rise really nicely and not what they call keyhole or mushroom over the sides. Because this dough is now going to double. And in order to let it rise, either you have to coat it with a little bit of, actually I always coat it with a little bit of the nonstick cooking spray, but either you can put a piece of plastic wrap that's also been coated with the nonstick cooking spray, or you can use a plastic box, which is really my favorite, because then you never have to worry about it touching the surface and sticking to the bread. And if it's cool in the kitchen, the perfect thing is to just use hot tap water, a cup of it, and change it every half hour or every 20 minutes. And then you'll have an even temperature that's around 80 degrees. You don't want the bread to be rising much hotter than that because it develops off flavors. Colder is okay, but it will just take longer. And there you have a perfectly shaped bread loaf. Here are the 3 different doughs that we shaped, all from the same basic dough, but 3 different breads. Aren't they lovely? Nothing is better than homemade bread.